Eduardo Guerrero was born on October 9th, 1967, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest son of famous Mexican-American pro wrestler Eddy Guerrero. Eddy's brothers, Chavo, Mando, and Hector, were also pro wrestlers. Eddy made his pro wrestling debut in 1986 at age 18. He was already a good wrestler during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and he clearly showed a lot of potential. In 1992, Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre, CMLL, which is the oldest existing wrestling promotion in the world, decided to repackage Eddy as Máscara Mágica. Eddy didn't really like this idea, and CMLL never seemed to be too serious about doing much with him to begin with. So Eddy decided to take a rebellious risk and jump ship to the newly formed AAA League. This turned out to be a great move, as it was during this time that Eddy started blossoming. He wrestled in AAA from late 1992 through early 1995. Eddy would also tour New Japan Pro Wrestling on a regular basis during this time. His springboard moves made him stand out as one of the workers to keep an eye on. In New Japan, during the summer of '93, he was repackaged as Black Tiger II. The Black Tiger gimmick was first used by English wrestler Mark Rocco back in the early 1980s, and Rocco was one of the main rivals of the first Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama. While Eddy did a very good job at portraying the Black Tiger character during the mid-1990s, it seemed that the gimmick limited him from truly shining as much as he potentially would have been able to without the gimmick. By the way, in a shoot interview, Eddy mentioned that New Japan had initially asked Fit Finlay to be Black Tiger, but Finlay had obligations in Europe, so they asked Eddy to play the character instead. The summer of '93 was an eventful summer for Eddy, as in that same summer, Eddy would turn heel in AAA after his tag team partner Love Machine Art Barr had turned heel. The tag team of Eddy and Art, La Pareja del Terror, was part of a stable called Los Gringos Locos, and they were the top heel stable in AAA at the time. Other members of this stable were Misterioso, Conan, Luis Piccoli, Black Cat, and Chicano Power. In New Japan, in October 1994, Eddy teamed with Great Sasuke and made it to the Junior Heavyweight Tag Team League Final. They lost the final to Wild Pegasus and Shinjiro Otani. On November 6, 1994, Eddy and Art lost the Hair vs. Masks match to El Hijo del Santo and Octagon at a AAA show called When Worlds Collide. Their match was an all-time great one and stole the show. The future looked bright for Eddy and Art, but Art would pass away later that month. Eddy would go to Extreme Championship Wrestling, where he feuded with Dean Malenko. This feud is considered to be one of the best feuds in ECW history, and it helped establish that ECW wasn't necessarily only about garbage wrestling. Once they were signed by World Championship Wrestling, Eddy and Dean would continue to impress American crowds with their impressive junior heavyweight style of wrestling, but this time in front of larger crowds. In New Japan, Eddy made it to the Best of the Super Juniors 2 semifinal in the summer of '95. Eddy lost the semifinal to Canadian wrestler Wild Pegasus. This was truly a great match, and these two also had a great match against each other earlier in the tournament during the group stages of the tournament. While their matches in WCW weren't as great as their matches in Japan, Eddy and Pegasus had several memorable matches in WCW. In 1986, Eddy would win the Best of the Super Juniors 3 tournament by defeating Jushin Thunder Liger in the tournament final, which was one of Eddy's biggest accomplishments as a singles wrestler. In the summer of '97, Eddy would turn heel in WCW after having been a babyface for that league since joining them, and he started feuding with Rey Mysterio Jr. Eddy and Rey would have one of the most memorable matches in WCW history at WCW Halloween Havoc on October 26, 1997. Unfortunately, Eddy would over the next several years have some personal issues, mostly due to addiction problems. During the final years of his career and life, Eddy wrestled in WWE. In WWE, Eddy once again feuded with Rey Mysterio Jr. But Eddy also got the opportunity to feud with wrestlers he had never wrestled before, like John Bradshaw Layfield. One of Eddy's most famous WWE matches was a very bloody match against JBL on May 16, 2004, in which Eddy defended the WWE Championship. On November 13, 2005, in a hotel room in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Eddy Guerrero passed away at age 38 due to heart issues. Eddy Guerrero was a great wrestler who was one of the most recognizable names in international junior heavyweight competition during the mid to late 1990s. He really started growing as a wrestler in 1992 when he started touring Japan and joined AAA in Mexico. In the years from 1993 through 1997, he was a highly respected competitor who was usually an excellent and sometimes even a truly great wrestler. When he started wrestling in the United States more permanently, his career would slowly start becoming less interesting when viewed from an in-ring perspective. This wasn't just exclusive to Eddy's work, of course, as this was the case with most wrestlers who would stop touring Japan and start focusing on being an American-style wrestler. But even when he was wrestling for the American leagues, he was always one of the most interesting guys on the cards of those American leagues. My overall conclusion of the career of Eddy Guerrero is as follows. From 1989 through 1992, he was good. He showed a lot of potential, and it was probably no surprise to those who watched him perform during those years that he would end up becoming one of the most famous and respected pro wrestlers. In 1993, he was very good. He really started blossoming as a worker, and versatility started becoming one of his main strengths. In 1994, he was excellent. It was in 1994 that he truly showed the wrestling world that he was an excellent wrestler that everyone should keep an eye on. His work in Japan and Mexico during 1994 was even better than it was in the previous years. In 1995, he was great. 1995 was Eddy's peak year. He showed his greatness in AAA, New Japan, ECW, and eventually WCW. Some of his very best and most memorable matches took place in 1995. In 1996 and 1997, he was excellent. Despite 1996 feeling slightly less of a memorable year compared to 1995, Eddy still had several memorable matches that year, both in Japan and the United States. In 1987, his input was super strong, and he was one of the most exciting performers in WCW, but he no longer toured Japan regularly, which hurt his overall output. In 1998 and 1999, he was very good. Eddy didn't necessarily decline as a worker during these years. It was more the fact that WCW didn't book Eddy properly during these years, and that caused a lower rating for these years. From 2000 through 2005, he was good. During these years, Eddy was in WWE, and he adapted quite well to the sports entertainment style and got over really well with the WWE crowds. However, this was arguably the weakest era of his career when viewing his work from an in-ring perspective. After having been a good worker who showed lots of potential to become even better, it was in 1992 that Eddy slowly started turning into the wrestler who had become admired by many. During his first tour for New Japan Pro Wrestling, the Top of the Super Juniors 3 tour in 1992, he wasn't overly impressive yet, but the tour was a very important learning experience. His work was quite good during the end of 1992, as he was quite a solid and oftentimes impressive performer in trios matches in AAA. He would continue this trend in 1993 and 1994. 1994 was actually quite a strong year for Eddy, as he really stepped up as a worker and was involved in several matches that were excellent or better. 1995 is arguably his very best year, as he gave impressive performances in New Japan, ECW, and WCW. After 1997, his work would become increasingly less interesting, as he would become more used to and content with working the American wrestling style, in addition to an increase in steroid usage. In particular, his run during the years of 2000 through 2005 in WWE wasn't very memorable compared to his work during the 90s. Despite, of course, Eddy being one of the best workers on the WWE roster at the time and far more memorable than most other sports entertainers over there. By the way, Eddy wrestled some matches in New Japan in 2002, but the majority of those matches weren't nearly as interesting as his matches in New Japan from the mid-1990s. When we take a step back and look at Eddy as an overall worker, we can say that he was a very complete all-round performer, as he was able to have success in Mexico, Japan, and the United States. By 1995, it had become clear that he was able to work different styles at a high level in different countries, which made him very useful for all the companies he would wrestle for. Also, he had always been superb at executing moves excellently. In the end, we have to come to the conclusion that he was an excellent wrestler during the mid-1990s who was sometimes even great. He was never not a good wrestler. He was always at least good, and during his best years, he was clearly significantly better than just good. However, one can't help but feel that despite his tremendous talent, a lot of his matches didn't end up being as good as expected for various reasons. That being said, Eddy Guerrero is definitely one of the best 75 men's wrestlers ever, and arguably even one of the top 50 men's wrestlers ever. Here is a list of the 10 best matches of Eddy Guerrero.